particularly in the Western Hemisphere. I want to thank them for their time and generosity to share with us their knowledge and, above all, their expertise. So many thanks to Lucia, Cecilia, Jose Pablo, and Chris. So as you will see, this particular panel will examine the main trends and evolution of transnational organized crime in Latin America and the Caribbean from a particular multidimensional scope. It has a focus on transnational organized criminal networks, also illicit economies, arms trafficking, to name some topics. So with no further ado, allow me to explain the structure of the panel. In order of appearance, that is Lucia, Cecilia, Jose Pablo, and Chris. Each expert will have a first intervention of up to 7 minutes, trying to address the following question. What are the main trends and dynamics of transnational organized crime in Latin America and the Caribbean? After this first round of appearances, we will have a shorter set of interventions from each speaker in order to have a more dynamic and fruitful talk. And at that point, anyone can jump in, whether to build on what someone has already said or to follow up its previous remarks. After all, we want to make this panel a technical conversation, but a conversation, ultimately, amongst team of colleagues. And finally, just to, by the end of the panel, we will have a Q&A session. So for those who are watching this panel, feel free to type in your question or questions in the chat box only. So having said this, and just like explain this kind of structure or the mechanics, I will start by reading Dr. Lucia's bio. So let me find it first. Yeah, here it is. So Dr. Damert is a distinguished professor at the Universidad de Santiago de Chile, renowned for her expertise in various areas of social research. Her scholarly pursuits encompass a wide range of topics, including urban violence, urban inequality, police reform, community participation, and the intersection of crime and public policy across Latin America. Her extensive body of work is marked by numerous books and publications in prestigious international journals. In addition to her academic contributions, Lucia Damert has played pivotal roles in advisory positions of significant impact. Notably, she served as chief of advisors to the President of Chile from March to October 2022, providing invaluable insights and guidance. On the global stage, she made substantial contributions as a member of the Advisory Board of Disarmament Issues for the Secretary General of the United Nations from 2017 to 2021. Furthermore, her intellectual influence extended as she held the esteemed position of Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars from 2013 to 2020. Lucia Damert's distinguished career and multifaceted expertise continue to shape academic and policy discussions at both national and international levels. So, Dr. Lucia Damert, it's quite an honor to have you on board. Please, over to you.
Thank you, Fausto, and thank you, GI-TOC, for this invitation, and of course for my colleagues in this panel. Without further ado, I'm just gonna mention 5 elements that I think that are part of the context throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And the first one, they're not really good news. The first one is that we have a weaker criminal justice system in general. This criminal justice system is incapable of tackling current illegal market challenges. Second, we have weaker political systems that are prone to try to solve these issues with a very short-term responses, and political will that was stronger before, perhaps 10 or 20 years before. Now it's really short-term. So it's very difficult to find Latin America political will that will allow us to implement institutional reforms or institutional definitions that will allow us to tackle illegal markets and and organized crime. The third element is that we have an increasing and diversified corrupt practice throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. These corrupt practices are not only at the local level, but also at the regional, at the national levels. And those are not as easy to point out as before. The fourth element of the scenario is that we have blurred boundaries between legal and illegal economies throughout the hemisphere. And those, those very blurred boundaries and those practices involve multiple private sector actors that are sometimes playing within, the legal and illegal economy. And the final dimension of the context is that we have an increasing and diversified culture of illegality throughout Latin America that sustain most of Latin Americans' way of life nowadays. So taking into account those 5 elements that in fact redefine the way society acts, the way society looks at criminal organizations, the way institutions, state, non-state governments actually see criminal organization and illegal markets, I just want to mention 5 dimensions that I think that characterize illicit economies throughout the region. First of all, illicit economies or illegal markets are booming, from illegal mining to illegal fishing. But we have, lots of different industries that are now being developed in the illegal world. However, we are stuck fighting drugs, mostly. Our focus in terms of criminal justice system is really very much focused on the drug war. The second element is that extortion and extortive practices to individuals and companies and small and large companies have become daily situations for most Latin Americans. That's the way a small and medium-sized criminal structure ensures regular money. And for that situation, we really don't know what to do. Responses from, in many cases, are very local, sporadic, and non-sustainable. The third element, and perhaps my colleagues will talk about this in more definition, but I think that there is a complete flexibility of routes and management of local businesses. And for that, I think that there are no countries that are safe from routes of any illegal market. There is no port that could be defined as really safe from being contaminated from this type of presence of those industries or illegal economies. The fourth element is that I think that in countries such as Mexico, Peru, Brazil, or Colombia, there is territorial governance that has consolidated. In most of those countries, that territorial governance is not being developed in a war against the state, but is developed in companion with state institutions. So I think that in some areas in Latin America, we really need to redefine the idea of criminal governance and move towards, mafia states or narco states, because that will allow us to really talk about what is really happening throughout the region. And the fifth element, the last one, still violence continues to be the way criminal structures define territorial presence But I am wondering if violence would continue to be the way that criminal organizations define their relationships, because they are moving towards a different level of organization, a different level of territorial presence. And in that sense, we really, in Latin America, we really need to take into account a different measure to be sure that illegal markets or criminal organizations are present in a specific territory. And for that, I think that not only we need to de-drug center the agenda of criminal organizations in Latin America, but also we need to find different metrics, different indicators along with homicides that will allow us to point out where the situation is actually growing. Nowadays, we actually take a look into the homicide rate in order to see whether the situation is getting worse. But considering these elements of the context, perhaps we will have places that have no or very little presence of homicide, but very important and stronger illicit economies being developed. So I just want to stop here and let my fellow colleagues to talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lamert. Thanks for giving this landscape in Latin America when it comes to transnational organized crime. A rather difficult context indeed, and but thanks for being brutally honest and giving this particular background. So I'll continue with Cecilia, Dr. Cecilia. So I will proceed to read her bio. Dr. Farfan Mendez is a researcher with the Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation at UC San Diego and the Center for Studies on Security, Intelligence and Governance, CSIC, at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, ITAM. Dr. Farfan is an expert on organized crime, US-Mexico security cooperation, and gender mainstreaming. Her work focuses on understanding the business models of criminal groups. Dr. Farfan has testified before the House of Representatives Judiciary Committee on US-Mexico border policy and has consulted for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the Organization of American States, the United States Institute for Peace, and USA. Dr. Farfan regularly guest lectures at the US Foreign Service Institute, is a member of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, GI-TOC, the Urban Violence Research Network, and the Strategy Committee for the Journal of Illicit Economies and Development. A Fulbright scholar, Dr. Farfan received her doctorate in political science from UC Santa Barbara, her master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University School of International Public Affairs, and her bachelor's in international relations from the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, ITAM. So, Dr. Cecilia, it's a real pleasure to have you here again. Over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Fausto, and thank you for that introduction, and more importantly, for organizing and convening this panel. I'm delighted to be having this conversation with these colleagues. So, building on what Lucia was just mentioning, let me focus specifically on firearms trafficking, and within that, let me explore two ideas that hopefully prompt a conversation. So we've known for a long time that the Americas is the most violent region in the world, right? And to Lucia's point of how we use homicide data to sort of evaluate that, you know, the Americas right now has a homicide rate of about 15 per 100,000 people. And this is more than double the world average that is around 5.8 per 100,000. So we know that, you know, most homicides that happen in the world take place in the Americas. And more importantly, around 67% of these homicides that occur in the region are perpetrated with a firearm. So what this tells us is that we cannot look at criminal dynamics without looking at firearms trafficking and how that impacts the region. Now, I would make, and here's where the proposals come in. I would suggest that we start looking at firearms trafficking not only as a business of firearms trafficking in itself, but rather as a subsidy of sorts that criminal groups in the region have, to the extent that it's very easy to acquire firearms from the United States and then traffic them throughout the region. This essentially functions, I would argue, as a subsidy for criminal groups. And if we think about it from the perspective of the business side, violence is an input for them, right? This is another thing that they have to manage and they have to take care of. And again, to the extent that it's easy to acquire firearms, but also ammunition in the region, this means that the costs of doing business, in particular perpetrating violence, is reduced. And so in some ways, different programs in the region work at counter objectives, because essentially what we're seeing is now some of these criminal groups receiving what I would, call, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely sarcastic, an aid package of sorts every year with state-of-the-art technology. So the firearms and ammunition that they can acquire from the US, we're not talking about, old firearms, we're not talking about old ammunition or things that were not destroyed. This is, as fancy and as new as you can get. And so that's the first idea, to think about how the ability to acquire firearms essentially subsidizes criminal groups. And what you want is the opposite, right? Ideally, perpetrating violence should be expensive for them, not only from the criminal justice side of things, but also from the actual expense of paying and perpetrating this violence. So in line with that, and this builds on some of the work that I've been doing or I did for the last year with the Organization of American States, one of the things that is not necessarily that known is that member states of CIFTA, which is essentially the arms trafficking treaty in the region that not all countries in the region are part of, but enough countries, and certainly those that are really affected by violence, by gun violence, are part of, is they recently approved a methodology for measuring the impact of firearms trafficking in the region. And this is in part the result of, again, not having enough information of what are these impacts, right? And beyond knowing homicides, and again, to Lucia's point of needing better measurements, is, okay, how, besides knowing how many people get killed with a firearm, what are other impacts that this has in private property, in public health, and a number of other factors. This methodology is divided into 5 modules, and one of them has to do with asking experts around the world, with a particular focus in the Americas, what do they consider are the main threats that the region has when it comes to firearms trafficking. And what's interesting is that an initial pilot test where I worked with these experts showed some interesting results. So of course, on the one hand, we have answers along the lines that we need better infrastructure to be able to detect firearms trafficking in the region. And these are not necessarily always great news for governments, because on the one hand, building better infrastructure takes time, and it also costs a lot of money. But besides those measures that take a lot of time and can take a lot of money, there are other things that are, a lot less expensive that could definitely be implemented in the short term. And this is, I would highlight a couple that I think are relevant for our conversation today. So one of the things that came out of that pilot test with this group of experts was a need for better coordination between the private and the public sector. And when I mention the private sector, I specifically talk about manufacturing companies, exporters, and importers of firearms and ammunition. And this may seem very obvious, but let me explain why I think it's relevant when we talk about trends. On the one hand, this coordination has to do with what happens with private security companies. As security has deteriorated in the region, one of the responses that we have seen from the private sector is that instead of working with state actors that are often seen corrupt, and in some cases, with good reason, there's a sense that you can buy yourself out of this problem, right? That you can, if you hire private security, then somehow you're not going to be affected by these criminal dynamics. But the reality is that to the extent that, or as these private security companies grow in the region, the states do not have enough resources to monitor what is happening with the firearms that these private security companies have. The reality is that states don't have the capacity to conduct, for instance, the site visits to these locations and know, whether or not these firearms are actually being used in adequate ways. And this is worrisome because potentially, and this is something that came out again of this pilot test, you could have a situation where you have firearms that are properly registered, but in the evening or during the shift that they're not supposed to be covering, they're essentially moonlighting for other types of criminal activities. And being able to detect that, it's very hard for the state. And again, this is worrisome because to the extent that violence in the region increases and there's a sense that you can buy yourself out of this problem, in fact, you're contributing to these criminal dynamics with having more private security. The other reason it matters to have this coordination, and this will be my last point, so we can go over to my fellow panelists, has to do with another trend that was identified as part of this work, and that had to do with private shipping and mailing companies, where essentially we know firearms can be trafficked in whole, but they're also often trafficked in parts. And so when you have different parts of a firearm that are moving through the post service, it's again very difficult to tackle that, and that requires that coordination. So I will wrap this first intervention by saying, any conversation that we have, I think, in Latin America going forward about criminal dynamics has to be part of this conversation of what is happening with firearms trafficking, and also including how the US facilitates that trade. And again, I underscore, because on the one hand, it subsidizes the cost of perpetrating this violence, but on the other hand, because it also creates these difficult challenges and dynamics with private security companies and also now mailing companies that we know, own willingly, but are part of this chain of events. So I'll stop there for my first intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fafan. A quite compelling epistemological change, the one you were proposing regarding the firearms trafficking, and well, actually, the intricacies between private public sectors, how it subsidizes violence, and also to see it as a business model. So a very interesting viewpoint. Thank you very much indeed. So I will go now with Jose Pablo. So I will read her bio. So Jose Pablo Pudia is a Mexican lawyer and policy analyst with extensive experience in security, justice, and rule of law, particularly in addressing challenges related to organized crime and non-state armed actors. He has served as Chief of Staff, Deputy Director, and Law Clerk at Mexico's Supreme Court. Jose Pablo holds a Master of Public Administration from Columbia University and is currently the Senior Associate managing U.S. government projects at DAI. His expertise lies in advancing governance, strengthening institutions, and implementing reforms within complex legal and political frameworks. Jose Pablo, thank you very much for being with us today. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fausto, and everyone else for joining. Also, big thanks to GI-TOC for organizing this series of events. I think they serve as a great platform to discuss challenges and solutions to issues of growing importance, not only to Latin America, but to the whole region. And today I want to address how migration enforcement policies, particularly at the US border, have unintentionally created new and very profitable illicit markets for transnational criminal organizations, TCOs. I think this is very timely and relevant since, as we all know, the US election is less than a week from today, and immigration has become a key issue for American voters. Of course, the policies enacted in the US affect the whole region, and so I think it's very important to discuss their effects, particularly as they relate to organized crime in Latin America. Just to provide a quick overview of the US election, as you know, it's shaping to be one of the closest races in history, with no candidate having a clear advantage over the other in any of the swing states. And in such a close race, immigration has become the focal point of the debate and a top priority among the US electorate. Just to put matters in perspective, 6 out of 10 voters say immigration is critical to their vote, and 88% of registered voters support tightened border measures or policies. However, although Americans are rooting for stricter policies, there's a factor that's often overlooked, that although they intend to secure the borders, they unintentionally open new avenues for criminal organizations to profit, first by increasing the demand for specialized smuggling, and thus that demand increases the price. Recent policies, just to place things in today's environment, we can talk about the Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP, or Stay in Mexico or Remain in Mexico, as well as Title 42, that have added further restrictions to migration by requiring either asylum seekers to wait in Mexican border cities for their US court hearing, or to allow rapid expulsion under Title 42. These policies have left migrants trapped in very unsafe cities and created bottlenecks that expose them to transnational criminal organizations. The question, I think, now becomes, why did they started or got involved in smuggling in the first place? And as we know, this policies have created those incentives by first tightening the security and thus creating a much more challenging environment to cross the border, thus generating an increased demand and prices for organized smuggling networks that migrants need to use in order to make it to the other side of the border. Initially, they used local coyotes, who were entrenched in the communities, but as restrictions and risk increased, so does the need, for highly organized networks that charge higher prices. It is worth noting that smuggling has evolved into a highly complex and organized multi-billion-dollar industry, with recent estimates calculating that smuggling now generates around $13 billion annually, up from the $500 million that used to generate a few years back. Moreover, these policies have not only increased the demand and thus the price for smuggling, but they have also exposed migrants to other forms of exploitations. I know Chris, one of our co-panelists, will look into some of the other forms of exploitation, and I don't want to spend much time on this, but I do think it's very important to note that TCOs capitalize on every aspect of migration, from tolls, kidnapping, extortion, forced labor, sexual exploitation. This is the whole process is extremely profitable for them. And this profitability in turns also help us understand why they have become increasingly involved in local politics, as well as in legal sectors or markets, as Dr. Damert announced during her intervention. I just want to delve a bit deeper on this, since, well, as territorial controls becomes increasingly essential for sustained profits, TCOs have evolved beyond their traditional criminal operations, that is, drug smuggling, gun trafficking, and so on, to being actively engaged in politics and in legal economies to protect and expand their influence over the region. Politically, this transformation has materialized in their influence on government and law enforcement decisions, as well as their clear influence in electoral outcomes. And economically, as I was just mentioning, they have diversified into legal markets, which we can find many examples: Mexico's avocado and lime industries, gold mining in Peru, logging in the Amazon basin, and well, we can find many more examples. However, I do want to score that this transformation signals the recognition that controlling territories, economies, and population is critical to their operations. These organizations are increasingly acting as de facto authorities, shaping political and economic landscapes across the region. And while Mexico might be a very visible example of this transformation of formerly illicit concentrated groups into political and economic drivers in the whole region, which poses a growing threat to governance stability across Latin America. Just to start wrapping things up, I think all of this highlights a vicious circle. On the one hand, we have restrictive US migration policies that unintentionally empower organized crime across Latin America, that do not only benefit from smuggling and other forms of exploitation, but they have also increasingly influenced political outcomes and secure their operations, involving themselves in legitimate industries. Just a final thought that I think is very important is that disempowerment exacerbates corruption, undermines states' authority, and creates volatile regions, pushing more people out of their own countries. Ultimately, and I know there are a lot of facets to this problem, but US policies, while aiming to manage migration, what they do is that they often fuel the very conditions that drive people away from, again, their own countries. In conclusion, US migration has unintentionally fueled a vicious circle that empowers cartels. And looking ahead, looking to the election in a few days, we can only hope that the incoming administration, I guess, if Trump get elected, we can't have a lot of hope, but that they examine the migration and migration policies as a multifaceted challenge. We should start talking about establishing safe and legal migration pathways that can reduce reliance on cartels, as well as strengthening regional cooperation with Latin American nations to address the socioeconomic drivers of migration, while supporting local governance and reforms to create economic opportunities across the region. Thank you again for listening, and I hope this conversation helps create a safer and more stable future for our region.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, Jose Pablo. I mean, in one word, interconnectedness, how, well, the paradoxes of tighter migration policies in the United States, how this empowers TCOs by giving them more revenue streams. In this case, a $13 billion business. I mean, the whole supply chain in this kind of this illegal supply chain. So thank you very much. Now it's Princess's turn. I will proceed to read his bio. It's right here. It's actually very brief, Chris, your bio, but you have a remarkable background, nevertheless. So Chris Dalby is the founding director of World of Crime, a consultancy based in the Netherlands, bringing a solutions-focused approach to the study of transnational organized crime. He's the author of the World of Crime Guide to the Jalisco Cartel New Generation, to be published. Well, actually, it has already been published. So it's hopefully it will become a very important book on the subject. So prior to this, he was managing editor of Inside Crime, the leading think tank, for 5 years, and was a foreign correspondent in Mexico, Brazil, China, and Malaysia. So Chris, coming back to the detonating question, what do you think are the main trends of organized crime, transnational organized crime in Latin America and the Caribbean?
Of course. Thank you so much, Fausto, and thank you to GI-TOC for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here. I'm going to talk about one thing, which I think is one of the most important trends in organized crime worldwide, but exemplified in Latin America, which is extortion. In December 2021, Lucia Damert on this panel published an excellent investigation on extortion in Latin America. She called it at the time the backbone of criminal activity in Latin America. I'm going to use her metaphor for a second, her imagery. If extortion is a cancer, it has metastasized. It is no longer just the backbone of criminal activity in Latin America. I would say it is the lifeblood of criminal activity in Latin America. Extortion has become a necessity for many criminal groups, large and small. In my book on the Jalisco cartel, I talked about how across Mexico, the CJNG local bosses use extortion and a very localized, expert approach to extortion to finance their operations. And that continues to be true right down the criminal value chain to smaller, fragmented groups who see an easy barrier to entry to organized crime. But extortion is the best and easiest way to sustain themselves. It is now a common phrase to say that in many parts of Latin America for years now, organized crime has taken over a monopoly on the use of deadly violence from the state. But I think there's now a growing trend where criminal groups are openly challenging or outright seizing the monopoly on collecting taxes and then deciding how you use... My apologies. I'm getting over a bad cough. And then using those taxes to make public and private investments. What do I mean by public and private investments? Because some of these extortions as a way of cementing their power are used then to make public gifts, to make public investments, to make the lives better in a very controlled and localized way, but to foster community relations. It's a very perverse economic vicious cycle. Now, the problem with that is that the type of extortion and the range of extortion is growing. It used to be that extortion in Latin America, and I'm not talking about gota a gota, I'm talking about precise, targeted industrial or sectorial extortion, was primarily focused on agricultural means, right? We all know about avocados in Mexico as something that causes a lot of headlines. Fisheries, obviously, are a common target for extortion. Cattle ranching, but still agricultural means. That has grown very rapidly. And we now see entire sectors, let's start in Mexico, tourism. If you go and talk to hotel owners, restaurateurs in Puerto Vallarta, in Los Cabos, in Cancun, in Tulum, all of them, virtually all of them, set aside a thousands of dollars a month to settle extortion claims. If you go to Ecuador, the mining sector is now a targeted sector. If you go to Guerrero and Michoacan, you have multinationals, open multinationals, Canadian leading mining companies threatening to close down mining operations or suspend operations because they can no longer afford extortion costs. And I accept that Mexico could probably do better without Canadian mining companies, but I'm proving a point. How do you fight this? Well, you would say that you have to fight this with the help of chambers of commerce, with the help of local officials who understand the economic makeup of their states or their municipalities and can begin to suggest alternatives. The problem is that extortion is a very easy way to also cement your political support at the local level. Several of my colleagues on this panel have talked about mafia states and political fiefdoms. Extortion is a godsend to governments like Venezuela, to governments in parts of Brazil, to governments in parts of Mexico. I would even say in parts of El Salvador, where extortion, where you have criminal groups shaking down your average population, your average businesses, now even graduating to shaking down multinationals, and then kicking that money or part of that money up the chain to their political paymasters. That's a wonderful way of cementing that relationship, because it essentially allows corrupt politicians, corrupt police officers, corrupt prosecutors to even further distance themselves from the criminal activity in their area. And even when there's pushback, even when we see criminal networks temporarily disrupted, like the crackdowns of Maduro in El Salvador, like occasional crackdowns currently in Ecuador, like occasional crackdowns with the National Guard in Mexico, even when we see a temporary crackdown on extortion, that extortion, sadly, is all too often taken over by members of the security forces, right? So what do we do about it? It's very difficult. There's no current blueprint, no current policy solution that I have seen that addresses the way in which extortion has become sclerotically embedded in the way that companies run. If we look at Rio, you now have entire luxury buildings built off the books by the militias, which they rent or sell. And an extension of that, in a sort of perverse formalization of extortion, force residents to use their internet services, to use their parking spots, to use their gas services. So if we extend the notion of extortion to forcing entire populations, entire parts of municipalities to use your public services, it becomes almost impossible to root out. One thing that I would say we need to incentivize is multinationals in Mexico and elsewhere are becoming more concerned about extortion. And a lot of conversations I have with them is, well, what do we do about it? And one thing that you do about it is you protect your supply chain. I've spoken to CEOs, I've spoken to risk managers, I've spoken to country managers in Mexico who tell me, yes, we're aware of this. It's not affecting our bottom line massively so far. When you dig under the surface and you start talking to them, okay, how is it affecting your suppliers? How is it affecting the Mexican companies that work for you? How is it affecting your workers? How is it affecting the logistics, the transportation, the port access for your goods? Then you begin to get different answers. Then they begin to say, well, actually, it is affecting us, but the cost is being more burdened onto our local partners. That, for me, is embarrassing. When a multinational sort of cares about extortion only when it affects their bottom line, but not when it threatens the lives and economic well-being of their local partners in Latin America, that's one step where I think we can begin to incentivize a common front. Beyond that, and I regret that, unlike my colleagues, I don't have many policy recommendations for this, this is an emerging trend. And I think the full political and economic impact of extortion in Latin America is far from being fully measured or understood.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for delving into this extortion issue. So, Dr. Namer, would you like to build on what someone has already said, or maybe follow up your previous remarks? I mean, you mentioned 5 systemic problems in Latin America with regards to transnational and organized crime, a weak criminal justice system, weak political institutions, corruption, not only locally, but nationally and regionally, blurred boundaries between legal and illegal economies, and a culture of illegality. I mean, it's remarkable the way you frame these systemic problems. Would you like to follow up or jump in to build on what anyone has said?
Well, thank you, Fausto. This is great because, we are actually looking at the same monster from different perspectives and different frames, and in an interdisciplinary perspective too. But we all realize that this one side is the illegal market and the criminal organizations, but the other side is the state. And the states, I'll say. As Cecilia mentioned, the role that the U.S. play in the armed trafficking, and the role that, weaker states play when extortion is not being even prosecuted. As Chris said, extortion is the perfect crime because no one is actually pursuing an investigation, even at the very huge industrial type of extortive practices. And of course, one of the areas that I think that we need to focus more is in how to link criminal activities and the whole process of migration in Latin America, but taking the migrants not only as what is happening now in most countries in Latin, at least in South America, perceiving and the migrant situation not as perpetrators of crime or part of the Tren de Aragua situation, but mostly as victims of very, specialized type of organizations that are moving people and are exploiting people throughout Latin America. And of course, when we talk about drugs, drug trafficking is very different from trafficking of people. And we are moving people from 5 or 6 different countries throughout the Latin American realm. And that requires institutional, blindness. That requires corruption. And in that sense, I believe that not only GI-TOC, but all of our research has to move, in a broader scope, not only looking at, the specificity of the criminal situation, but how that specificity is also, eroding democratic values, limiting party systems, and at the end of the day, enhancing the whole process of institutional weakening. So my perspective, Fausto and colleagues, is that we will have in a couple of, perhaps in the short term in Latin America, we will have to have a decision. We are going to try to get lower violence, lower homicide rates, or we are going to really fight against illegal economies. Because we can have both. That's our situation right now. We can have illegal economies that are actually booming throughout Latin America with lower levels of violence. And that's a political and technical decision. So my sense is that, that dichotomy between criminality and or criminal organizations and homicide rates or violence in general will have to be discussed. And just let me say something else about what Cecilia mentioned. It's clear that around 67% of all homicides are involve gangs, and most of them are not only linked to organized crime. So there is another problem that regular violence, intimate violence, violence against women, violence on street, violence on schools, they're also using guns. So the gang issue is not only a criminal issue, but it's a societal issue, increasingly a societal issue in Latin America. And for that reason, I think that what Cecilia mentioned is really important, to focus on armed trafficking along with others. And that would be my comment, Foster.
Great, Doctor. Yeah, I mean, it is said that policy it is a decision between inconvenience, and the way you frame it. I mean, what do we do in the short term to lower homicides, to focus on lethal violence reduction, or to fight illegal economies? I think that's a very difficult decision to make, but necessary nevertheless. So at least, as you said, in the short term. So thanks, Doctor. Dr. Farfan, any thoughts, any reflections on what we have discussed so far, or maybe build on what you have said?
Thank you. Yeah, I suppose a number of scattered thoughts, building on what my fellow panelists have said, and hopefully then we can go into other questions. But thinking about, for instance, what Chris was mentioning about extortion, right, and how it has become this very prevalent almost way of life, right? It's not even considered a crime. It's sort of kind of also, again, part of that cost of doing business, unfortunately, in some contexts. And one of the things that we found when we did some work related to that in Tijuana, for instance, is that it also ends up creating situations where low income areas actually end up paying more for basic staples compared to, wealthier areas in the city. And this was very obvious to us, for instance, with the price of tortillas, because extortion is passed along to the consumer, right? This criminal tax then is paid for by the consumer. And what was interesting about a city like Tijuana, that is, some of it is very connected to the US economy, in particular the California economy, is that those businesses that had links to the US were somehow a little bit more protected from extortion than those mom and pop shops within the city that do not have those linkages. And so it ended up creating this paradox where, again, these low income areas were paying more for basic services. And so I think that's also something that we have to, keep in mind as we think about, what do you do about extortion? I think also to Chris's point about what do you do, when the private sector comes to you and asks, for instance, what should we do about extortion? I think it also shows how, especially foreign direct investment in the region, only considers security still very much as the physical security of their infrastructure, right? But it's not necessarily considering what you were saying, this bigger environment of what it means to operate in a given city, right? And so when they start unpacking, well, what is happening with my suppliers, then you realize that it's actually impacting you in more ways than you think, right? But I think to the extent that countries just welcome FDI without actually taking also an opportunity to rethink, security, not just as the physical infrastructure, we'll continue to see this massive contrast, right, between having, like we do here in Tijuana, an Amazon warehouse facility, right, in one of the poorest areas of the city, without necessarily thinking what are, potential investments that we could do that we know work to also reduce levels of violence. And since I'm already on the topic of Tijuana, and again, I did say this were, some scattered thoughts. I was in Sonora last week, and one of the things that came up that when Jose Pablo was mentioning about how the business of, human smuggling and also human trafficking has changed is that in talking to people who have studied migration in that part of the border now for decades, the old school coyotes are getting out of the business because they now think of it as too dangerous for it. And I think it's very telling when you have someone who participated in a particular, illicit activity, and again, not to criminalize migration, right? But this activity that was making money of people trying to get to the US, when they're telling you, well, I don't want to be there anymore because now it's a violent space, right? So I'd rather go do something else and not really work, trying to cross people because it's involved with other forms of territorial control. And so I think those are some interesting things to keep in mind. The final comment I will say for this round is that as we think about, states have a finite amount of resources, right? And so it's like, is the attention going to go to reducing those levels of homicides or trying to tackle these other illicit economies? I think one thing that is concerning, and this is speaking particularly from the case of Mexico right now, where the new administration has spoken on the need to have better intelligence. And the concern that I have is that what will happen to some of these states that under the guise of creating more intelligence, you're actually using it to surveil who you consider to be political opponents. And this is not an abstract, worry. I think in the Mexican case with Pegasus, for instance, we know it has been used to track journalists, track activists, even, feminist organizations. And so, with that idea that these states need better intelligence, which I agree, it's true. There's a need for better intelligence, but what are the controls that are going to be attached to that? And so I think as we think about what are the decisions that will go into trying to reduce levels of violence in the region, I think there's also a question around accountability with the tools that the state will have to use, for collecting intelligence.
Yeah, Thank you, Dr. Cecilia, for bringing up this, for bringing to the table this human rights dimension regarding intelligence and better intelligence generation. So, Jose Pablo, any reflections, any thoughts, even though they may be scattered, as Cecilia said, it's okay. We're having a nice conversation.
No, for sure. I do have some following comments scattered for sure, but I'm getting the sense that like we are incurring in this sort of error of thinking of criminal organizations and states as two completely different actors with opposing interests and some zero interest, rather. What I win is you're lost, and so on. However, I just finished a very good book that I'm sure all of you have read, Votes, Drugs, and Violence by Sandra Ley and Guillermo Trejo. And one of, I think, of the most interesting proposals is that we have to stop thinking about states and criminality as two opposing actors. Rather, they intersect at some point, both bad or corrupt officials with those criminal actors that they are supposed to be fighting. And so this leads me to argue that we cannot continue to think about solutions from only a law enforcement perspective, because the incentives in many ways are not to enforce the law, but rather to set up mechanisms to reduce impunity, and rather than having security either reforms or increasing the budgets directed towards security, really focusing on impunity to sort of disaggregate or separate this sphere of interconnection between states and bad actors. If we continue down this path, we can have increased budgets, the military interventions, and so on. But that point of connection will not allow us to move forward and really hold accountable those officials who have enabled where we are now, and the criminal organizations that sort of promote that circle of corruption. That's my first idea. Secondly, I was interested in this topic. Well, Dr. Farfan mentioned about going to Sinaloa, and that sort of touches upon the point I was just making, because as you know, the apprehension of El Mayo, one of the leaders of the Sinaloa cartel, brought an uptick in violence like we've never, or it's been very bad, and we haven't seen that violence in many years. And that leads me to also think that this separation between criminal organizations and states makes the solution even more complex, because what we see with this uptick in violence is that who was in charge of the security in that state, at least, or in some cities, was the criminal organizations. And the apprehension of one of them sort of generates a big wave of violence, with the state not being able to face it because it was not involved at all in maintaining the peace. So we end up with this concept of Pax Narca, at least in Sinaloa, as a very clear example. Finally, I was also interested about this consideration about intelligence. I'm also worried about the new proposals by the incoming administration in Mexico to employ or strengthen its intelligence efforts, not only because they will be spying, that, or at least continue their espionage practices, but rather because again, this collusion between criminal organizations and government will perhaps allow this increased intelligence, cartels and other organized criminals to get firsthand information about the operations that are being conducted, where they are being conducted, and so on, allowing them to prepare accordingly. So, yeah, I think, again, just to wrap my intervention, I think my biggest concern as we think of solutions to this very complex problem is to stop thinking about cartels, transnational criminal organizations, and state as having different and conflicting interests, because in many cases they are one and the same. So with that, thank you.
Thanks, Jose Pablo. The government crime nexus indeed something we need to address, and these intertwines with what Dr. Damer mentioned about the problem of weak criminal justice systems. We need to strengthen these criminal justice and not only focus on law enforcement, but also giving a criminal justice perspective as well. So Chris, over to you.
I want to push back on something. While I agree with Jose Pablo on we have to stop distinguishing between criminal organizations and the state as being separate, I think this is a two-step process. One thing that is consistently frustrating when you're talking to intelligence at any level is this vision of organized crime as a monolith. And I'm not trying to make this confused, but if we're going to fight a criminal organization, we need to understand what makes that criminal organization tick, what makes that criminal organization different to all the others. Even before El Mayo, the Sinaloa cartel operated very differently and usually more pacifically than the Jalisco cartel, right, which has killed statistically way more people in Mexico over the last decade. Extortion, just to stay on the theme that I've been bringing up, is connected to political power. It's connected to homicides. It's connected to a need for organizations to finance themselves. It's connected to a need for organizations to establish territorial control. El Chapo didn't like extortion. He didn't usually allow it in his home turf in Sinaloa. The Chapitos do allow it, but in a much more regulated fashion. The Jalisco cartel allows it in a much more disproportionate fashion, but based on state productive databases. So it's very educated extortion. My point being, we have to be able to understand how each criminal group and how each sort of smaller network, fragmented network operates. Why? Because that's the only way that you're going to have targeted interventions. I think everybody on this panel thinks that these big, sweeping, top-down budgets, top-down intelligence reforms, creation of new security units like the National Guard don't work. Why don't they work? It's because they don't get to the nub of the problem. We need to be less ambitious. We need to be less sweeping, and we need to have much more targeted approaches. One thing that I liked with Claudia Sheinbaum when she was mayor of Mexico City is that she traveled to the US, or Omar Garcia Harfuch traveled to the US, others of her team, looked at cities of comparable makeups to Mexico City, what worked in those cities, what worked in specific neighborhoods, and tried to apply that to Mexico City relatively successfully. I'm not impressed with President Sheinbaum's security plan at the national level, but that targeted, localized approach that she brought to Mexico City was a breath of fresh air. It was something that I think more mayors in Mexico or more governors in Mexico should adopt. And I think that's, if we're looking at this as a huge iceberg, how do we chip little parts of it off? You start by saying, okay, what has worked in other parts of Latin America or in other parts of Mexico? How can we apply that to comparable areas? And I think that's where you begin to create, let's say, pockets of resistance. I know I'm talking in a very lofty way, but I think we need to go from the bottom up rather than from the top down.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks. Yeah. Well, I was wondering, maybe we can go straight to the Yeah, we're running out of time, so we can go straight to the Q&A session. There's a question from Valentina that is directed to Lucia, and actually Lucia has already answered, but I think it's worth reading it. So Valentina says, you mentioned the overwhelming focus on the war on drugs in Latin America, policy making, and the changing organization of criminal networks. Regarding these new structures, what considerations should states keep in mind at the time of policy making of other criminal activities? Yeah, and
It's a very difficult question, Fausto, because it's very, it's very broad. And let me just jump in very quickly with two ideas. One is that it's very different from, being Trinidad and Tobago to fight drug trafficking throughout the Caribbean and illegal fishing and other type of illegal economies than being Brazil, that has around more than 1,000 illegal mining places. I don't know how to call it in English, places in where, illegal mining is being developed. So these are different states and capacities, but in both cases, they're not really able to fight these illicit economies. So my sense is that, as Chris was saying, we really need to get far from, the whole structural reforms ideas. I work a lot on that. But nowadays, we really need to have a specific like teams or focus on groups that will be able to figure out what to do with the specific illegal economies. And let me tell you that since we have illegal economies of, secondhand clothes, since we have, such a broader situation, I will focus in those economies that have a direct impact on human beings. And for that, I'm saying, the traffic of people and the traffic of migrants. I think those are illegal economies that should be tackled really fast and should be the priority of Latin America. And that doesn't mean that, I don't care about drugs or illegal mining or illegal lodging, but the fact of the matter that you have thousands upon thousands of people being traded throughout Latin America, mostly women, you have slaves on sex work and other type of work. So my sense is that if we can get politicians together behind one idea, that idea will not be drugs, will not be money laundering, perhaps could be, illegal trafficking of young people. And perhaps we can find ways to do, and this is my, positive part of the day. Perhaps we can do something with the Tapón of the Darién. It's incredible that we have this place that, 500,000 people are walking through, and everyone knows that the cartel is doing, business there, and actually the governments are basically, looking to the other side. So perhaps we can get some political will for that. I'm less confident on other type of illegal activities because most of them have, as my colleagues mentioned, increasing state and non-state participation. Thank you, Valentina, for the question.
yeah, and thank you, Dr. Lucia, for your answer. Chris, raise your hand.
Yeah, just one thing to add. I agree completely with Lucia that the issue of trafficking, especially of young people, of young women, is massive. The focus on the Darién is correct, and that is obviously the catalyst and for this. But I want to present a different case study from Mexico, again related to extortion. But the number of young people being recruited in Mexico and migrants into fake labor. Cartel de Jalisco, actually, probably the strongest one in Mexico doing this, being put into warehouses, fake offices, and literally chained to desks and being made to commit scams online. There's a huge panic right now in the US government for these scam compounds in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia, in Laos, in Vietnam, where there's about 300,000 people in slave conditions, working scams around the world. That's happening in Mexico. That's happening in Brazil to a lesser extent. But the cartels are not stupid. They see this opportunity. It's less exposure. It's less risky. It's less dangerous. And that's coming to Mexico. You're beginning to see this more sophisticated, much more sort of peaceful, because it's less homicide. But that's coming to Mexico. And that combines extortion, that combines criminal adaptability, and it combines what Lucia is saying, which is the trafficking of young Mexicans and young Central American migrants into these conditions. And that's something that nobody's looking at.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. We have two more questions. One from Randy Masisak. Sorry about my pronunciation. With focusing primarily on the financial aspects, freezing assets, freezing bank accounts have a bigger impact on organized crime than traditional methods such as catch and arrest. And the other one made by Jose Maria Isabel. What are the main concerns you think we must address in regards of criminal governance and influence of criminal groups on, one, formal economy, for example, avocados in Michoacán, and two, political elections in Mexico, for example, judges' elections? Anyone who wants to jump in will be welcome.
I can take the financial aspects of crime question. I think in theory, this is always sort of like follow the money, right? And take care of resources. And in practice, it's a lot harder to do. I mean, the US, that by all accounts is a high capacity jurisdiction, has less than 1,000 people sentenced each year for money laundering. And so that tells you, I mean, and the US is an interesting example because the more sophisticated groups actually prefer to launder money in places that have high levels of compliance, that have robust financial systems, because this offers a number of advantages, right? You're not trying to launder money in places that don't actually have financial services. It's quite the opposite when you're a sophisticated criminal group. And so if a place like the US prosecutes and sentences effectively less than 1,000 people, and in part this has to do because there's plea deals that happen along the way, it tells you that it's actually very difficult to do. And the other side of that is that I would argue that financial institutions often make a calculation of the profit versus the cost of whatever fine they're going to have to pay if they get caught, right? And oftentimes the profit that comes from helping in this type of activity tends to be much bigger than whatever fine or whatever agreement you come to with the prosecution side. And so I think it's very hard to actually do it. And the other thing that I would add to that is that within financial institutions, the compliance side is often, they don't necessarily work as a unitary actor, right? And so the side of the bank that needs to give information to the compliance side often does not do it because, again, profits are at stake. And so I think there's a lot of, is this in theory a good idea? Absolutely. I think what we have seen, though, is that in practice it's a lot harder to do. And more so then when it involves more countries, that then it requires vetting mechanisms that are agreed upon by the two or more countries that are working together in an investigation to exchange information. And we have seen that exchanging that information is actually quite difficult, and in particular in the Americas. I think there are cases from Europe that we see have taken years to build and develop, but there's a very different mechanism compared to what we have in Latin America, and countries actually wanting to exchange information and trusting partners to do so.
Thank you, Cecilia. Anyone else? And there's still remaining the second question made by Jose Maria. What are the main concerns you think we must address in regards of criminal governance and influence of criminal groups, particularly informal economy and political elections in Mexico?
I think if it's okay with the rest of the panel, I can take a first stab at it. I know we have 1 minute left, but just very briefly, I think, well, each sector varies from the next. So I guess the solution should be, again, tailored to the specific sector or industry where criminal organizations have infiltrated. But I do think that for every industry, both supply and demand must be targeted, in the sense that for supply, farmers should have other economic opportunities. I always come back to impunity because when the cost of committing crimes is, or of extorting, kidnapping, killing, etc., it's so low as it is today, at least in Mexico, there is probably no way around it, and they're frankly only victims, not only of the criminal organization, but also of the state. Regarding the demand side, I think, for example, in terms of avocado, the U.S., the primary importer of Mexican avocado, should start thinking and placing, I actually not sure if they have already, placing some safeguarding or responsible consumer policies around it. They did something similar with tuna at some point when they caught dolphins. I'm, of course, not implying that it's the same thing, but sort of the same mechanism of also tackling the demand side of this product. And regarding the political elections, particularly with judges in Mexico, I don't have an answer. I'm very concerned about it, especially because, the way that they're being financed has already been stipulated by law, and they're supposed to be safeguardings to avoid being financed by organized crime. But honestly, I don't have high hopes regarding that.
Thanks, Jose Pablo. I think it's time to come to a close. Unfortunately, as a moderator, I wasn't able to make questions, but I'm sure we will be able to continue this conversation, whether in virtual or in person panels. Thanks again to the speakers, to you, Lucia, Chris, Jose Pablo, Cecilia, for your participation. Also, thanks to those who attended this panel. We hope to see each other again in future events.